This happened to me last November. I was staying in Aberdeen then, an industrial town in the northeast region of Scotland. I was working the late shift at a packing depot down in Aberdeen, just off Wellington Road. My shift wrapped up at 1:20 in the morning. The whole place was completely dead. Normally I take the late bus back up towards Torry, but I'd missed it by 2 minutes. That day the coastal fog was so thick you couldn't see the length of a car ahead of you. I didn't want to wait for another 45 minutes in the freezing drizzle, so I decided to walk it. It's about a 3-mile trek, mostly down long, empty roads through the industrial estate before you hit the residential streets. If you know that part of Aberdeen, you know it's miserable after midnight. It's all massive grey granite warehouses, massive lorry parks and metal fencing. When the weather comes in off the North Sea, the fog gets so thick you can't see your own boots. I tightened the hood of my jacket, shoved my hands deep into my pockets and started walking. The silence out there is heavy. When the factories close down for the night, there's no traffic, no birds, nothing. Just the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of your own boots on the grit. The street lights are those old orange ones, and they don't really clear the fog. They just turn it into these big, glowing pockets of amber, leaving everything else pitch black. I was about 10 minutes into the walk, just passing the old metalworks yard, when I heard the whistling. It wasn't loud. It was a good bit behind me, maybe 200 yards down the road I'd just walked. But because the night was dead, it cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't a frantic sort of whistle either. It was slow, cheerful, a proper lilting little melody, the kind of tune an old man whistles when he's working in his garden on a Sunday morning. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was another lad from the late shift, or maybe one of the lorry drivers stretching his legs after a long haul. I kept my pace steady, watching the breath cloud up in front of my face. But after 5 minutes, the tune hadn't changed. It was the exact same 8 notes, repeated over and over. I slowed down a bit. I wanted whoever it was to just overtake me. Walking alone in the fog is bad enough without someone tracking your heels. But as soon as my pace dropped, the footsteps behind me dropped too. I couldn't hear the boots clearly over the whistling, but the distance between us stayed exactly the same. I stopped. I stood right under a streetlight, took out my phone, and pretended to look at a text. The whistling stopped instantly. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. I looked back over my shoulder into the dark. The fog was too thick to see anything beyond 20 feet, just a wall of gray and orange mist. Nobody appeared under the previous streetlight. Nobody called out. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, the cold damp seeping through my trousers, listening to the sound of my own heart thumping against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin, completely swallowed by the fog. No answer. I turned back around and started walking again, faster this time. Within 3 steps, the whistling started up right where it had left off, except it was louder now, not because the person was running, but because the pitch had changed. It was sharper. I decided to test it. I didn't take the main road towards the bridge. Instead, I took a sharp, sudden left down a narrow access lane between 2 massive timber warehouses. It was a dead-end route that technically looped back around through a derelict yard, but nobody used it because it was completely unlit. It was pure pitch black. I scurried down the lane, my trainers slipping slightly on the wet leaves, and then I ducked behind a massive metal skip. I pressed my back against the cold steel, held my breath, and waited. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the drip of water from the warehouse gutters. Then I heard the boots turn the corner into the gravel lane. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And then the whistle. It was right at the mouth of the lane now. It sounded different inside the narrow gap between the buildings. The stone walls gave it a horrible, metallic echo. The footsteps stopped right outside the skip. I was frozen. My knees were shaking so hard I thought they'd hit the metal. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the dark was thick enough to hide me. Through the gap between the skip and the wall, I could smell something. It wasn't alcohol or cigarette smoke like you'd expect from a late-night creeper. It smelled wet, like rotting seaweed left out on the harbor walls. The whistling started again, but it wasn't the tune anymore. It was just a long, single, drawn-out note. A high, piercing hiss that went on until the lungs behind it should have run completely out of air. It lasted for a full, unbroken minute. Then the boots turned around and walked away, back out onto the main road. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I scrambled out from behind the skip. I didn't walk. I ran. I didn't care about looking paranoid or making noise. I just sprinted down the rest of the lane, cut through the broken wire fencing of the derelict yard, and didn't stop until I hit the main residential street near Victoria Road. Seeing the rows of terraced houses and the parked cars made the blood stop roaring in my ears. I felt stupid. I told myself it was just some local junkie playing a sick game, trying to scare a working lad on his way home. I reached my tenement block, fumbled like an idiot with the keys, and finally got the heavy wooden communal door open. I slammed it shut behind me, turned the massive iron deadbolt, and leaned my head against the wood, gasping for breath. The stairwell smelled of old carpet and damp dog, familiar, safe smells. I walked up the 3 flights of stone stairs to my flat, locked my own front door, put the chain on, and went straight into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of tap water. My hands were shaking so much the glass clicked against my teeth. I walked into my bedroom, didn't even bother turning the big light on. I just wanted to get into bed and forget the whole miserable night. I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of the mattress, and took a long drink of water. The flat was dead quiet. I was just starting to calm down, thinking about how daft I'd been, running through the streets like a lunatic, just because some idiot was whistling in the dark. Then I heard the heavy wooden door at the very bottom of the communal stairwell slam shut. Thud. My stomach just dropped. It's an old building, and you can hear everything through the floors. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, my glass halfway to my mouth, listening. Then came the footsteps on the stone stairs, heavy, slow, concrete steps echoing. They weren't rushing. They were just walking up, floor by floor. I tried to tell myself it was just one of the neighbors coming back late from the pub. But deep down I knew. They reached the top landing, my floor. The footsteps stopped right outside my front door. Absolute silence for about 10 seconds. I wasn't even breathing at this point. I was just staring at the bedroom door, praying to God I'd actually turned the deadbolt when I ran in. Then, the brass handle of my front door slowly rattled. Someone was pushing it down, testing the lock. When it didn't open, they didn't try to kick it in or shout. Instead, they just started walking slowly down the length of the communal corridor outside my wall. And they started whistling again. It was right through the plasterboard, so close I could hear the wet intake of breath between the notes. They were just strolling up and down the hallway in the dark, checking the other doors, waiting to see if I'd panic and look out, or just letting me know they'd tracked me all the way to my doorstep. I didn't move an inch. I sat on that bed in the pitch black for 3 hours, clutching my phone, too terrified to even make a call because I thought the vibration or the screen light would show under the crack of the door. The whistling went on for about 20 minutes before it finally faded back down the stairs. I didn't leave the flat until it was broad daylight and I could hear the milkman outside. I packed my bags that afternoon. Like I said, I live in Arbroath now. I don't work the late shifts anymore, and I don't care if people think I'm soft. The second I get inside any building now, the bolt goes on immediately. But I still don't sleep right. Every time the weather turns and the fog rolls in across the coast, I just sit there in the dark thinking. I think about that brass door handle slowly moving down. I think about how close I came to just leaving it unlocked, like I usually did when I was tired. If I'd been just 30 seconds slower running up those stairs, or if I'd left my keys in the lock, I don't even like to think about what would have happened when that handle went down. Maybe I wouldn't be sitting here telling you this story.